My name is Robert Perry. I'm here today in Ventura, California at the Calvet Veterans Residence of Martin Singer, who served honorably as a first lieutenant in the United States Army. Mr. Singer was an Army combat engineer from 1943 to 1946 and was in the European theater during World War II. On behalf of the Conejo Valley chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Aquila Chase chapter of the Colonial Dames of the 17th century, it's my honor to interview you concerning your service in the Army during World War II.
Yeah. Martin, I'd like you to tell us when and where you were born.
Born in New York City on November 13, 1923.
All right. And who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My father was Nathaniel Singer, and he operated an optical company called Softlight Lens, which had lenses made by Bausch & Lomb and sold them to people in the United States and around the world. My mother worked for the city a great deal. She was a director of various hospitals. She also helped to put up a new prison on Rikers Island for women, which is called the Rose M. Singer Prison.
Named after her?
Named after her, yes.
Now, what was your father's name?
My father's name was Nathaniel.
Nathaniel. Nathaniel Singer and Rose Singer were your parents then?
That's correct.
And did you have any siblings?
I had two brothers, Edward and Ronald.
Were they older or younger?
Younger.
Younger, okay. How much younger?
Edward was 5 years younger and Ronald was 8 years younger.
Okay. Tell me what it was like growing up in Manhattan.
Well, it was very different than it is today. We always lived near Central Park, and we would play in the park and go to school, go to the theater or whatever was appropriate. And I actually left town. I started off at PS 9, which was Public School 9. I went from there to Friends Seminary, which was a Quaker school. And then I went to a prep school called Loomis up in Windsor, Connecticut.
Right. Now, how old were you when you went to the Quaker school?
I was about 10.
And where was that located?
That was located downtown on 15th Street.
Okay. And then how old were you when you went to the Loomis prep school?
I was about 14.
14. All right. So you were in New York City until you were 14.
That's correct.
Right. And then Loomis is up in Connecticut, is that correct?
Yes, that's okay. Right.
Right. So until you were 14, what was it like in Manhattan? I mean, tell me about it. What was that like growing up there?
Well, as I said, we played in the park and we went to the movies and we went away in the summertime someplace outside the city, up in Maine or in Europe or whatever it might be.
Okay. Now, after you graduated from Loomis, what year was that?
That was in 1941.
1941. After you graduated from Loomis, what happened next?
I went to college.
Where was that?
Harvard.
Harvard University?
That's correct.
Right. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you went to Harvard between 1941 and, was it 1943?
1943, June of 43.
June of 43. Now, what happened then?
Well, I went to Harvard just before the war started. I went there in September. The war started December 7th, the day after a football game that we all watched. Harvard against, I forget what the other team was. And about noontime on the 7th, we learned that we were at war because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And from there on in, the college was on a wartime basis where there was an acceleration of classes. We went to school during the summer. They had a full term in the summer of 42. And since I was in ROTC, that meant a great deal more work for me during the summertime.
Did you enter Harvard in an ROTC program as soon as you got there? Or
yes.
Okay.
In September.
And that was Army ROTC, right?
Army ROTC, yes. We were field artillery. And
field artillery.
That's correct. And in 43, in June, we had finished 3 years. And at that point, they had our whole ROTC unit, about 60 of us. We were sent down to a town called Athol, Massachusetts, where we were inducted in the Army in Camp Devens. And then we were sent down from there to basic training at at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which was the Field Artillery Basic Training Unit.
Now, did you all volunteer for active duty in the Army at that point when you?
We didn't have the option. We were ROTC.
So they basically drafted you guys into the Army.
We weren't drafted. We were part of the Army in ROTC.
You're already part of the Army.
Yes.
I got it. Okay. All right. So they just basically just gave you orders to go.
That's
go
correct.
there, right? Okay, I got it. Okay. Yeah, it's a different time then. Okay, so now you're in basic training down at Fort Bragg.
Fort Bragg.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was what year?
That was in 43, in June of 43. We
June
went
of
to
43.
June 3rd, 1943.
Okay. Now, did you go through the regular basic training before you went to officer candidate school?
Yes, we did. We went through basic training with a bunch of Ivy League schools going through, together with local people who were quite different from us in terms of education. And then at the end of the 17 weeks basic training, they were obliged to send us to OCS, but the OCSs were all full. So they sent us back to college, where we spent a couple months. There was a V5 program going there, which had started in September, but when we got back in October, we were put into the regular college for 2 months.
Was that at Harvard again?
At Harvard, yes.
Now, you went as a unit, is that correct?
We went as a unit. And we spent 2 months going to classes and marching to classes and going back to our barracks alone, to our buildings. And then 2 OCSs opened up. One was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which was field artillery, and the other was at Fort Knox, Kentucky, which we were told was armored field artillery. Well, we all opted for the armored because we wanted the cannon on the truck instead of behind the truck. We got to Fort Knox and found out they didn't have any armored field artillery. All they had was tanks. So we became tank officers. Went through training, 2-week exercise at the end of it. And as we were graduated, found out that a general had decided he didn't need any tank officers. So we all became engineers. And in order to qualify as engineers, we went to a training course at Fort Belvoir in Virginia for 6 weeks.
Fort Belvoir.
Fort Belvoir.
Okay.
And we were there for 6 weeks.
So you had 6 weeks training at being a Army engineer.
That's correct. At the end of the course, there was a question that was asked of all of us. You have your platoon lined up in front of a bridge site, and the sergeant says, "All present are accounted for, sir." What is your reply? The only acceptable reply was, "Sergeant, build the bridge and get the hell out of there. You don't know anything about engineering." 6 weeks later, we were in Germany building bridges.
All right, very good. Okay, so what happened next?
We went to Fort Breckenridge, Kentucky, where we trained with the 1271st Engineer Combat Battalion, and went to New York, where we boarded the Mariposa, which was a ship that used to go from Los Angeles to Hawaii, a cruise ship. And we sailed without escort across the Atlantic to Marseille, a 10-day trip, which was pretty uncomfortable. And
Troop ship, right?
no, it had been converted to a troop ship from a pleasure ship. And we got there, and our colonel, who had been a tactical officer at Engineer OCS, and was quite a disciplinarian, marched us off the ship and looked for somebody to give him directions as to where to go. We were new in France. We knew nothing about where we were going. So we finally found a corporal who told him, just go up the hill and you walk about 15 miles and you come to where you're going to stay tonight. So we walked up the hill. We walked 15 miles. with great difficulty, some of our men falling out along the way. And we got there, and the colonel asked what we were supposed to do and couldn't find anybody to tell him. So he just appropriated some area and said, pitch your pup tents over here.
Your pup tents?
Pup tents. Pup tent consisted of the canvas which we used to wrap our backpack with, which we put together with somebody else's canvas, and that made a pup tent.
You had shelter halves?
Shelter halves.
I'm familiar.
Right.
With the short stakes, yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And there were 3 officers of my battalion, in my company, who were together, so we decided to put the 3 of us into a tent, because that gave us an extra blanket down below to cover the wet ground. And we slept that night. The middle officer, being a first lieutenant, was in the middle between the 2 of us second lieutenants. He was an avowed Catholic who swore to God that he would never miss a service again if God would only get him out of this horrible place. So we spent about a week or so, about 10 days, arming and getting ready, during which time my colonel asked me to find some tents, some big tents. So I found a medical depot nearby where they had just come in from Africa, and they had all kinds of tents. So he said, sure, I'll be glad to give you these if you give me a couple of chainsaws. A chainsaw was a large saw in a coffin-like box, and there was an engineer depot nearby. So I took my truck and my men, we went over to the engineer depot, and I found not 2, but 3 chainsaws, because I figured we could use one for ourselves. We put those on the truck, and as we approached the gate, I leaned out and asked the guard at the gate what the direction was to such and such a town, and he said right down that way, never asked for our papers. So we got out of there with the 3 chainsaws and went back and exchanged 2 of the chainsaws for 10 pyramidal tents. Brought them back, and we then slept in tents for the rest of our stay there.
Now, was this a secure area that you were operating out
No,
of when you first
totally
landed?
insecure.
Totally insecure. There were Germans around, counterinsurgency?
No Germans.
Well, what was there?
Well, when the invading army invaded, there was nobody to safeguard the approach. So they just vanished, and the army went right on through and on up to the Strasbourg area, where the enemy was finally located. So there were no Germans at all in our area.
Okay, so it wasn't secure, but there was no enemy around.
No.
Okay. Did you have a rifle?
I had a pistol and a rifle.
What kind of rifle?
A pistol and a M1 rifle.
And an M1 Garand, or did you have a carbine?
I had a carbine, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And we did see traitors hanging from lampposts because the invasion occurred just about a week before we got there, and they hung them up and left them on the lampposts.
That must have been quite a sight to see.
It was, yes.
Okay, so was there any insurgent action or anything like that? Did you guys, any shots fired around where you were?
Nothing at all. There was no enemy at all in the area.
Okay. All right.
Then we moved up to closer to the front, and finally arrived at a little town just outside of Strasbourg, where we sat for a couple weeks.
This is still in France?
This is still in France. And we were assigned to repairing roads and clearing mines, which we did.
That was your specialty?
That was our specialty. And building bridges. And I was assigned to do reconnaissance for the battalion. I had been a platoon commander, and my platoon was 40 men, 3 squads of 15 men each, and a headquarters. And from that I became the assistant S2, or the reconnaissance officer. And I would go up forward to find out what was going on. And during that time, our troops were helping the infantry dig foxholes, because if you remember, that was a very, very, very cold winter. And we were just south of the Bulge. The Bulge was going on at that time. When we were stationed in the Strasbourg area, my job was to go out and do reconnaissance daily. We used to go up to the front lines where our men were digging foxholes for the infantry by using hand grenades or bombs. And we came under attack by aircraft. Unfortunately, they were American aircraft, and they had mistaken the area south of the Bulge as being part of the Bulge. So we came under fire by them several times. That was one of the experiences I had that I'd like not to live again. They spread...
What date was this by this time?
This is December of 44.
44 now?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
And...
You're just south of the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, and many of the divisions from our area moved up north to support the Battle for the Bulge, which means that our remainders were spread out, and they were trying to dig foxholes in frozen ground and had a terrible time doing it, so our men would go out with dynamite and dig the holes for them.
Now, you were a platoon commander. Were you still a second lieutenant at that time?
That's right.
Okay.
And I was also the, during the 1944 elections, I was the voting officer. I told the men how to vote in the election between Roosevelt and his opponent in September of 44.
You told them how to vote?
I told them how to vote, that's right. And the irony...
Wait a minute, by how to vote, do you mean did you tell them who to vote for?
No.
You
just
told them how they
explained
could cast their ballot.
That's right.
Okay.
And gave them advice and that kind of thing. And the irony of it was that I wasn't old enough to vote myself, because I was 20 and the age was 21. So we finally got up to the Strasbourg area, and there we crossed the Rhine at Mannheim, between Mannheim and Ludwigsburg. And we had an interesting experience. We crossed at night. It was totally dark, and there were no lights on in Mannheim.
Now, how did you cross it?
We crossed it in our vehicles.
There was a bridge there.
There was a bridge there. The bridge was intact. Well, actually, it had been built. The bridge was built. It was built by another engineer battalion. But when we got across, our colonel, who was, as I say, a disciplinarian, decided he was going to lead the battalion through the city because he knew the city. And he led us through the streets and around this one or up the other one until finally we came to an intersection where we crossed our own battalion. And nobody ever mentioned anything about it, but it was certainly the talk of much laughter.
An indication that you might have been going around in circles, right?
That's right, exactly.
Now, was this in Mannheim?
This is in Mannheim, yes. And we got through the city and went up to Heidelberg, where we built a bridge at a town called Ulm on the Danube River. And that was a bridge that I went out on the road and picked up an incoming Bailey Bridge. A Bailey Bridge is a bridge that has panels and footing. It's a pre-made bridge. You just piece together.
Does it float?
No, it's a suspension bridge. But you piece it together. All the pieces are made.
Prefab.
Yeah. And it was being brought up to the front by a good friend and classmate of mine. And the two of us stood in the middle of the road and greeted each other to the accompaniment of all kinds of horns of all the trucks that were waiting to get by on the road. And we took that bridge down to the bridge site, which was under fire because they had failed to clear the enemy from the far bank. They sent boats over and took care of the snipers that were there.
Wait a minute now. You're building a bridge on one side and the enemy's shooting at you from the other?
That's right.
Wow.
That was.
Did you actually have any fire coming your way personally? Did you feel any bullets going by you?
Not near me, no.
Okay.
I wasn't at the bridge site that much, but I saw the fire coming in. And then we moved on up through Germany and stayed at night either in a field or in a house, wherever it was that would be convenient for us to stay. And we finally got to Austria. And in Austria, we were in a town called Imst, which is in Austria near the Swiss border and near the Italian border. And in Imst, we were in May of 1945. And on May the 5th, there was an armistice declared, at which time all of the shooting stopped. The actual armistice wasn't signed until the 7th or 8th, and May 8th is the celebrated day for VE Day. But from May 5th to the 8th, there was no firing.
Ceasefire.
Ceasefire.
Now, did the Germans adhere to the ceasefire?
Fortunately, they did.
Good to hear.
Because what happened on May 5th was my colonel told me to make a reconnaissance up forward. We were about 30 miles from the border.
German border?
No, we were in Austria. We were 30 miles from the Italian border.
Italian border, okay.
Adjoining the Swiss border. We were right alongside Switzerland. So on the 5th, I went up with my Jeep driver to make a reconnaissance. And we passed through the town of Landeck, which is the next major town beyond us. And there was nobody around, so I kept on going. And there in the middle of the road, I saw a 2.5-ton American truck with German markings, obviously captured by the Germans and used by them. And it was just sitting there empty. So like a fool, I went up and I started the truck, which, as was pointed out to me subsequently, could very well have been booby-trapped.
Right.
And it worked. So I drove on forward into the next town with my Jeep following me.
With German markings on the truck?
German markings on the truck. And in the town square of the next town, there were 2 German trucks full of German troops. And as I sat there wondering what the hell I was doing, looking at a platoon of German troops.
Now, were you by yourself with your driver?
My driver was in the Jeep and I was in the truck.
Just the 2 of you, nobody else?
Just the 2 of us.
They sent you out on a recon with just you and your driver?
That's right. So, as I sat there, a dozen of the German soldiers came over to my truck. And I thought to myself, I hope that they're aware that we are having armistice going. They came up and they said, we'd like to surrender. So I said, okay, hop in. They hopped in the truck. I looked through the curtain between us. I said, do you have any weapons? Oh, yes. They started handing weapons forward. At that point, there were 2 German trucks in the square, and they had the remainder of the troops aboard. And they were yelling and screaming at the guys that had surrendered to me, and they left. So I circled the square and came back up to Landeck. And there in the middle of the road stood a full colonel, glowering at me.
Was he a German colonel?
No, he's an American colonel.
Colonel.
And he said, what the hell are you doing up there? Reconnaissance, sir. What do you mean reconnaissance? We're advancing by phase lines. And we're not supposed to go into that town for another 2 hours. What are you trying to do, ruin the armistice? No, sir, no, sir. I'm just doing what I was ordered to do.
Were you still a second lieutenant?
I'm still a second lieutenant. I was afraid I wouldn't be for long, but he said, what do you got in the back of the truck? Prisoners. I said, prisoners? What are you doing with prisoners when we're having an armistice? Get rid of them. So I went to the edge of the town, I turned to the prisoners, I said, raus, which means get out in German. Reluctantly, they got out and swore at me and walked away.
They were looking for some hot chow is what they were looking for.
Yes. And the next day, my colonel sent me down again. He said, this time I want you to go to the Italian border because we're close enough. I want to know what's going on. So I went down to the on deck and I found the full colonel that I had seen the day before. I said, Colonel, I've been ordered to go up and do another survey. I wanted to let you know before I did. That's okay, he said, I have a platoon going up there. It has half tracks and jeeps and so on. You go up and speak to Lieutenant so-and-so at the top of the hill. So I went up, I saw Lieutenant so-and-so and told him what I was supposed to do. He said, fine. He said, you take point. So I went out in front of them, and we had quite an experience. We passed through the surrendering German 6th Army. The entire army was surrendering. And they stood around their trucks with their leaders on the trucks, explaining, no doubt, that this was just a phase point in the war, that they would recover soon and come back and glorify Germany. And we got to the other edge of town, and the lieutenant said, this is as far as I go. I said, well, I have to go to the border. He said, so go. So I went.
By yourself?
By myself.
With your driver?
My Jeep and my driver. We got to the border, and there were the striped white poles across the way and people pointing rifles at me. And I didn't know who in the hell was in the guard shacks there. So I said, American, American. They said, what army? 7th Army. Oh, we're 5th Army. And that was the first meeting of 7th and 5th Armies. It was after the war, but that was the first time that they met.
It was you.
That's right.
You were the first meeting between the two armies.
The first meeting between the two armies. So we went back to the headquarters, and that was a rather memorable weekend for me because we had an incident at one of the companies, the company I had been a platoon commander in, where 3 of the officers and 3 of the non-coms had heard that there were some SS troops in the apartment building in which they were living on the other side of town from where I was living. So they took these 3 who were missing arms or legs, so they had been invalided to this town, took them up in the hills behind their building, interrogated them, and then killed them. This was during the armistice. So they had sent an inspector down from the inspection service to look into this matter. And on the night of the 7th, we all got drunk, very drunk. I went to bed in a double bed in my sleeping bag, and they put the colonel alongside me in his sleeping bag. We passed out. During the night, I threw up all over him. When he woke up in the morning, I said, "Are you feeling better, sir?" Hoping that he would think he had done it himself. That day also, I had an experience.
Wait, did that work?
It worked. Nothing. He had no memory of the night before. That night, I had been constipated for 10 days, riding around in my bumpy Jeep.
Eating C rations. Or K rations back then, I guess, huh?
C and K, either one.
Yeah.
And I went to the doctor, who wasn't there. His assistant, the dentist, was there.
The dentist?
Dentist.
You got the dentist?
I got the dentist. So I told him my problem. He said to 2 of the men, go give him an enema. So we went to the bathrooms. There were 2 bathrooms side by side on the landing between the 1st and 2nd floor of the apartment house we were building it in. And what we didn't know was there was somebody in the other bathroom. And what he heard was, "Bend over, Lieutenant. Now, I'm going to push this in, and you keep it in as long as you possibly can." And he went out the other bathroom to inform the battalion what was happening. So,
well, I hope they got that straightened out.
yeah, they got that straightened out. But then came the armistice, and that was the end of the war.
All right, now how did you get home?
We didn't go home. We went back to Germany. We went to Augsburg, spent some time in Augsburg, and then we moved down to a town called Donauwörth. don't know, is Danube.
So you were part of the occupation at this point.
Yes. And we took over in Donnerworth from the 2828 Engineer Combat Battalion, which is part of the 36th Engineer Regiment. The 36th Engineer Regiment had 8 battle stars from 8 battles they were in, 5 of them on D-Day.
Wow.
And they in Italy had been cited by General Mark Clark, who was the commander of the 5th Army. He said, my best 3 divisions are the 3rd, the 45th, and the 36th Engineers, because they worked as infantry much of the time that they were in Italy. Another reason he said that was the 36th Division had done very poorly, and he wanted to show that the 36th Engineers were better than the 36th Division. But they had enough points and they were going home. So we took over from them, abolished the 1271st, and became the 2828 Engineers. And we inherited from them everything they were doing. This included a battalion of POWs who had been released from a POW camp to do a 60-day work stint of clearing mines and building bridges and repairing roads under us. In other words, they were our working unit. One day, the sergeant major of this unit came to see me and asked if he could have a court-martial, because he said that there had been an incident where a sergeant had sent his clerk over to tell another guy to come and see him, and the other guy refused. So the sergeant went over, saw the other guy, and hit him and knocked him to the ground. And this guy was bringing charges against the sergeant.
For assaulting him?
For assaulting him.
Right.
So we went to my orderly room, and there was the major, was the battalion commander, 4 of the 7 captains, or 8 captains that were commanding there, the sergeant, the messenger, and the complainant.
Still a second lieutenant?
I was still second lieutenant.
Still a second lieutenant. Okay.
Yeah. And I asked the sergeant at one point, we had heard that there was some Waffen-SS who were part of the SS at the end of the war. At the end of the war, they no longer had enough volunteers. So the SS drafted people from other units to fill the spaces that they needed to be filled. And the Waffen-SS were not considered part of the SS by us because they were not volunteers, they were draftees. So I said to the sergeant, that fellow who got hit, was he SS? So I said, yeah. I looked at him, I thought that's a very strange way of saying it. So a little bit later I said, what about the sergeant? Oh yeah. Wait a minute. No Waffen-SS has become a sergeant because they only started at the beginning of 45. They couldn't have made sergeant by then. So a little bit later I said, what about the captains? Oh yeah.
Now, all these people that you're talking about, they're all German, right?
They're all German.
Yeah.
They're all sitting there.
They're all part of your POW.
They're all sitting there.
Yeah.
So I got rid of them, gave them company punishment, and called my colonel. Within 2 minutes, I had a call from the colonel who was the S2 or intelligence officer, G2 or intelligence officer of Corps. What's going on down there? Well, you know, sir. Well, are they at least in a confined area where they're under lock and key? No, sir. They're in a field in their tents, and they have their vehicles there and everything. They're set up as a independent battalion. He said, you get them into a structure right now. So I went down and saw the major, who was the commander, and told him, you know, we have all kinds of regulations in our army, as I'm sure you do. Please put up something around you to safeguard you. So they immediately put it up, They put up guard towers. I put machine guns in the guard towers and tripled my guard that was down there watching them. The next day, the CIC came out. That's the Counterintelligence Corps. And I told the major that we're going to have an inspection for your release. And they interviewed the members of the battalion.
The German battalion.
The German battalion. The CIC commander came up afterwards and said to me, "You're not going to believe this." He says, "There's 172 people there. 150 of them are SS. And not only SS, but the SS 1st Panzer Division, Hitler's personal bodyguard. That's what you got down there." I said, "And the officers? All the officers are SS except the major. He's Gestapo." Can you imagine that this unit was released from an American prisoner of war camp with the promise of 60-day release after working?
They did release them then?
They didn't release them.
They say it did or didn't?
They didn't.
Okay, you stopped it from happening then?
I stopped it from happening. So the next day I had orders to take them down to Dachau. The Dachau concentration camp was near us. And so the next morning, they lined up at 5 in the morning. And I said, "All SS, 2 steps forward." They stepped forward, some stepped back, some got pulled up. Finally, they were settled. And I put them in the trucks. Now, the trucks were the same trucks that had been through 8 battle stars. And they were pretty bad condition. But we had 6 trucks. We loaded 30 men on a truck. And then a 3/4 ton up front with the officers and the sergeant major. And my troops in jeeps in between. And we took off through Augsburg. In Augsburg, one of the trucks broke down. So what we had to do was to run the truck forward, stop it short. When everybody got pushed forward, we put 30 people in the back of that truck. That happened twice. So we ended up with 6 trucks coming into Dachau. And we got to Dachau and they got out yelling and screaming at me. And they were confined in Dachau. I have no idea whether they were called this. The Dachau camp was for people who were being investigated by the Nuremberg trials.
Okay, so all the Jews that had been there were gone, long gone.
All the Jews were gone. And what they had, I had, just a couple weeks before that, I had made the official inspection for the USArmy of the Dachau camp. I suppose I was selected because I was the only Jewish engineer officer in the area.
Now, what year, this is 1946 now?
45.
45. You remember what month?
It was in July.
July 45, okay.
Just after the close of the camps.
So you're inspecting Dachau now?
I inspected Dachau. Dachau was about 250 meters long, about 100 meters wide, and had a 10-foot wall surmounted by metal and wires. And inside there were 2 barbed wire enclosures, a small one up front where they had the officers of the staff there, their dining room, their supply room, everything like that, all the things required by a unit. And the other side, there were 24 barracks, 2 lines of 12 each, all within the enclosure.
Is that where they kept the Jews?
That's where they were kept. And I inspected one of these buildings using the Geneva Convention of 35 square feet per person. But I did it on 3 levels because there were triple-decker bunks. And I figured that instead of the 40 people that we would normally have in such a barracks, it's about the same size as a platoon barracks in our army. I put 200.
200 Germans?
200 Germans. You know how many Jews there were in that building?
I don't know.
2,000.
In that same building that normally would have held, 40 American troops?
That's right. They had them 3 to a bed, 3 beds high, sometimes 4 to a bed. And they had them on the floor, and they had beds in the hallway. It was just incredible.
How did you feel when you were there at Dachau doing all this, inspecting the place and so forth?
I did more than just view this. I viewed behind this enclosure. There was something called the building where a Brausbad. Brausbad means shower bath. There was a railroad track in back, and there was a platform. The train would pull up, and they'd unload the train of prisoners. They'd take out all the dead because every train had a number of dead on them. Then they lined the prisoners up, men, women, and children. Then they went through each of those lines, and they selected half of each. One half was marched off to the barracks and put away in the barracks. Of the women and children, almost all of the children were in the second batch, and only the attractive women were in the first batch. They then took the others that were left behind and marched them to the Brausbad. There they entered a very large room which had hooks on the wall, and they were told to hang their clothing there because they needed to be washed up preparatory to being put in their barracks. So they hung their clothes up on the wall, and naked, they marched into the shower room, which was next door. The shower room doors were closed, and they then infiltrated gas.
What kind of gas were they using, do you know?
I did know, but I don't remember the name. It was a gas that was especially developed for this thing.
Wasn't cyanide gas then?
It was similar to cyanide.
Similar
but
to cyanide, okay.
It was a special gas that was developed just for this purpose. They kept them there for about 30 minutes, at which time they aired it out, and they let in a group of prisoners who had been selected to be a crew to come in and clear out these bodies. They were told to inspect the bodies, all the crevices, make sure there was nothing hidden in the bodies, take out the gold teeth, anything that was of value, and then inspect the clothing. The clothing was then transferred to a place they called Canada. In Canada, they had another crew that worked on the clothing because much of the clothing contained valuables because the prisoners had no other place to keep it. The bodies were then transferred out back. Out back, there was 3 furnaces. Each of them had a metal table going into it. And on the metal table, they would put a body, incinerate the body. And then, if you can believe this, they took the ashes, put them in glass jars, and put a label of the glass jar with the number of the prisoner on the label. I don't know what happened to the glass jars.
You saw the remnants of all this when you were inspecting
Yes.
Dachau. This was not that long. I mean, this was July 45, so this was not that long after the
That's
Allies
right.
took those camps over.
That's correct.
Like a
They'd been cleaned up.
couple of months.
They forced the local people from the local town who claimed they had no knowledge of the camp. They forced them to come out and clean up the camp, which they did. They buried the bodies. They cleaned up the barracks, and it was in pretty good condition.
So what you saw wasn't as bad as
That's
what
right.
it would have been if you just marched right in there while all this was still going on.
Well, alongside this furnace unit was a hill, on the top of which were gallows, and that hill was used to kill additional prisoners. They either hung them, shot them, knifed them, or did whatever they wanted to kill them, and then they put them in the furnace. And then behind that, there was another camp, which was just a barbed wire camp, where they held political prisoners who were not subject to the same gravity as the concentration camp victims, but still many of them died, and some of them were actually released because they were political prisoners. And after we had one other experience in Augsburg, which in Donauwörth, which is interesting. There was a local brewery which had been closed at the end of the war, and they asked our permission to open. They did, and they brewed 18% beer. You have never seen so many drunken soldiers in your life.
That would be heavier than malt liquor, wouldn't it? Quite a bit.
Well, since the beer we were using in the Army was 3%, 18% was a bit of a rise. He did it just for the one night, but that was enough to have the place littered with bodies.
I think malt liquor runs about 12%, so you're going up a notch from that.
Up to 18, yes.
Did you drink any of it yourself?
No. I knew better. Shortly thereafter, we were assigned to move to Berlin. And that was an experience because we had a time at which we could cross the border where the Russians had control of the Autobahn, and they permitted you on the Autobahn only by their permission. And the time was 2 days from the day we started out at 6 in the morning. So we had 2 days to move about 100 miles. Not that far, 80 miles. And we did it in these old trucks that we had. I was the officer in charge of making sure that all the trucks made it. So the first night we stayed overnight, and I got in a little bit late with the last trucks. The second night, there were quite a few trucks that broke down on the way, and I did my best to get them up there, and finally got in at 5 in the morning, and we crossed the border at 6 and went into Berlin. Berlin was a city which was almost undescribable. This was in September of 45. By that time, they had rebuilt some of the houses, or at least temporarily rebuilt them. But it was an absolute disaster of a city.
Bombed to rubble, right?
Absolutely. And many, many, many people still remaining there. And they were just barely living. When we got there, I was assigned the task of rebuilding what used to be the German Supreme Court building, which was now used as the headquarters for the Allied Control Authority, which means that Eisenhower and Montgomery and Zhukov, the Russian, and Koenig, the Frenchman, met each month to make decisions on what was going to happen in Germany. And in between times, their staff worked in the building. This building was in pretty bad shape. It was missing most of its roof. It had wet rooms. We had to dry up the rooms with something called salamanders, which were kind of stoves that made the rooms dry. I was assigned the leading architect of Berlin and the leading German construction company to work on the building. And I was given 200 POWs to do the work, and my own platoon, of course.
How many men were in your platoon?
40.
And you were
And
first lieutenant by this time?
by this time I was the first lieutenant. And we worked on the building. We had some experiences with that. We needed tiles for the roof. We couldn't get permission from the Russians. I would go in each morning to the Russian colonel. There were 2 colonels running the building, an American and a Russian. I would go in and speak to the Russian colonel, and I'd use my Russian, which is very extensive, 3 words. I'd say, "Probus," which means pass, and he'd smile and he'd say, "Niet," which means no, and I'd say, "Spasibo," which means thank you. That's the extent of my Russian vocabulary.
So he would give you nothing.
He would give me nothing. So finally I told my drivers, "You just go out and get the tiles and bring them in." So they went out one night with their truck, and they loaded it with tiles and brought it back in. Nobody asked them anything.
Midnight requisition.
midnight requisition. The same way with lights. We needed lights around the outside. So I went to the place where they had the Olympics. The Olympics was in Berlin in the late 30s. And I went out there. The field was empty, so we took all the lights and brought them back, put them on the building. And then there were two major statues that were sitting in front of the Kaiser's home. They were gifts from the Russian Tsar. They were horses rearing up with a guy holding onto the reins, the reins. And each one weighed 6 tons. I didn't even try to get permission to get those. They were in the Russian zone. So far, they had not cordoned off the Russian zone. We could enter it without any problem. So we
It
entered
was to become the Russian zone.
It was the Russian zone, but it wasn't safeguarded. Yeah. So we went in there one Saturday with a couple of large trucks and a monster crane. I picked up the statues, put them on the trucks, and brought them back in.
What did you want them for? Why did you want the statues?
We wanted the statues. The statues were there. We took them.
You wanted them because they were there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody decided they wanted them, so they told me to go and get them. I go.
You were ordered to get them. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, I get you.
And we built platforms for them and set up the horses on them. And there's a funny sidelight to that. A couple weeks ago, I was looking at a movie called Jay and it was Joe, the two boxers back in the 30s, Joe and Max Schmeling and Joe Lewis. And there's a movie about them. And they had 2 fights. In the second fight, Max Schmeling had to get permission from Hitler to go to the United States to fight. So they had a picture of him going to Hitler's office. I'm sitting there looking at the movie. I looked at the building. I said, that's not Hitler's office. I've been in Hitler's office. I looked a little bit closer. They show a picture of the colonnades out in front. My colonnades. Of my driveway. Of my building. It was my building they were using as Hitler's office. So I got to see my building again a couple of weeks ago. It's still standing there. And
when was the movie made?
It made about 8 or 9 years ago.
All right. You did that building well. It's still standing.
I visited about 20 years after the war, and it was headquarters for air control for Berlin. And still all of the trademarks we had the 2828 was had as a symbol. I forget what it was, but it was on the clock, and it was on the window, and all of our signs were still there.
Yeah.
So they're apparently still there.
Now, can you get me from where you are right there when you restored this building to getting home to the States? Take me in that direction. How'd that work?
Well, let me add one other interesting experience. I built a bridge. That means I was assigned a bridge. I went out to see it. It was a monster bridge out in the Tempelhof Airport.
Where's that airport?
It was the only airport in Berlin at that time.
Berlin Airport, okay.
Yeah. And I was looking at this bridge. They had a bridge with meter beams and telephone wires and electrical wires and trolley tracks, everything like that. It's a real bridge. I'd never seen a bridge built before in my life. And I couldn't imagine what in the world they were doing. I was in charge of it.
They were building this and you were in charge of it, but you didn't...
I had no idea what was
You wasn't
going on.
aware what they were doing.
It was about half built. And up came a major general, a 2-star general. He said, "What's going on, Lieutenant?" "Building a bridge, sir." "Well, what's happening?" So I figured, he's a general, what's he know? He doesn't know as much as I know about engineering, and I know nothing. So I tried to ply him with words that I had learned about various things, elements you use to build a bridge with.
You were baffling them with a bunch of bull, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And when will it be finished? 3 weeks, sir? I had no idea. My only trip out there. I never went out again. And he left. I said to my colonel who was standing behind me, Colonel, what's that general's name? That's General Terry Moore, Chief Engineer, U.S. Theater. So I don't think I got away with it. The only time I ever spoke to a general. But then we got enough points and we went home.
When was that?
That was in August of 46.
46.
And we went to Camp Dix, I think, Fort Dix in New Jersey,
How did you get home?
by boat.
Okay, you're on a troop ship then.
Yep,
And how long did it take to get home across the Atlantic?
about 10 days.
10 days. Is that kind of a decompression time where you guys all got to talk about the war and what happened and all that kind of stuff?
Not that much,
Not really, huh?
no. It was too fresh to us,
To what?
too fresh,
Couldn't talk about it because it just happened, right?
yeah.
I see.
And we got in there, and I remember the sergeant that discharged us. I said, I hope that all of you expect, hope, fear, or pray to reincorporate yourself in society to succeed. And I always remember those words, expect, hope, fear, or pray.
Isn't that funny how you have a sergeant when you're all about to break up that gets up there and talks? We had one too.
Well, I left behind, at the end I was the company commander. The company commander had gone home and I took over the company. I left that behind and with no regrets. And I now was in New York once again.
All right, can you take me through what happened at this point? You were not married at this time, were you?
No,
Okay.
this is in September of, the end of August, the beginning of September of 46. And I went back to Harvard. I had a year to finish. I took a year's courses.
What were you majoring in?
Well, I started off majoring in history, but at the end of 2 weeks, we had the right to change majors if we wanted to. At the end of 2 weeks, I had 50 pages to read, a 500-page paper to write, 50 more pages to study, and a map of Silesia to draw, and I became an English major. So English literature was my field of concentration.
So that way you didn't have to do all that, or any of
That's
that, right?
And in my second half of that year, I was missing a course that was required in physics. So I took the course in physics, and I took the final exam. And the final exam was in the new lecture hall, which was a very large hall that had, we were on the honor system, 2 rows apart and 3 seats apart. And in between, we could see the exam of the guy in front of us. And he had an English exam. I could answer his exam, but I couldn't answer mine. I had 10 questions on my exam, and I could answer 3 of them, which meant, conversely, I couldn't answer 7 of them. So I wrote a little joke for each one, because we had a, what was his name? Benchley, Robert Benchley, was a very famous author. And years ago, he had written an exam in a law course where a ship was in a certain country's waters with a skipper from a different country and people in the trial from a different country. And he was supposed to write on the effects of this trial on the people on the ship. And instead of that, he wrote on the effects on the fish in the area. And he wrote a brilliant exam and got an A. Everybody who tried that since then, and that had been 20 years before, had got a failure. So I figured, oh, what the hell, I have nothing to lose. So I wrote these little jokes. I sat home and waited for my mark to come in. And finally I got a postcard. And my mark was a D minus minus. I have never heard of a D minus minus anywhere else, but that's what's on my records.
But you passed.
I passed. So that was my experience at the end of the war.
Now, you graduated when?
In June of 47.
June of 47, okay. Then you went to New York City again?
No, yeah, I went to New York City, and then I went up to Attleboro, Massachusetts, when my father had a frame factory, eyeglass frames.
You worked there as a manager?
And I worked there as a trainee at first, and then I traveled internationally to sell the product. Eventually, we moved the factory down to Long Island, and I became the manager. And we sold the company in 1950.
Now, when did you first get married?
I got married in 1951.
Okay, so right after you sold the company.
Yeah.
Okay. And what were you doing then? Did you get your own company, or?
I had purchased a small company called Harlequin. Harlequin was the originator of fashion in eyewear. Up until that time, it had been just what they have today, which is no style at all. And they entered the idea of weird shapes and weird colors, the wheel or ornamentation, that kind of thing on frames. And it was a very small company. I took it over, built a factory, and we ended up about the fourth largest factory in the country. And then we all had a problem because the optical industry decided that any retailer who had a frame more than 60 days had the right to return it for full credit. So we would produce a frame, then we would produce frames to back up that frame, and before those frames were finished, the frames were flooding back in. And there was nothing we could do with them. So we went broke.
And what year was that?
That was in 64.
Were you married by then?
I married in 51.
51. So tell me about your first wife. What was her name?
Her name was Nicole,
Nicole?
and she was a concentration camp victim.
Okay.
She had been in Auschwitz.
Right.
She lost her father, her mother, her brother, her grandmother, 3 aunts, and a bunch of cousins.
So she was sole survivor of a rather
Survivor.
large family.
That's right.
Why do you suppose she survived?
She was very pretty.
Okay.
And she was 17. And she was very lucky. So she came out of there, stayed with her uncle for a while in Strasbourg. And then he threw her out of the house for no particular reason. And her mother's sister invited her to Oklahoma. She went to Oklahoma for a year or so and then came to New York, where I met her.
How did you meet her?
She worked as secretary for a friend of mine.
Okay.
And we met and were married shortly thereafter.
Now, how many children did you have with her?
3,
And what were their names?
Suzanne, Michelle, and Martine.
So it's three girls or 2 girls and a boy?
3 girls.
3 girls. Okay.
They all live out here.
All right.
Suzanne is a rabbi in Riverside. She used to be in the entertainment business. She worked for TV for the government. And then she was a producer of TV in New York, of documentaries. She won 2 Emmys.
Wow.
And at the age of 40, she called me one day and said she was going to going to study Jewish history. I said, why? I said, you've never been in a temple, which is true. She'd never been in a temple. She said, I'm interested in it. She called me a couple months later and said, I decided to become a rabbi. I said, perhaps you hadn't noticed. You're the wrong sex. She said, oh no. She said, all the new rabbis are women. And they are. Just like doctors.
When was that?
That was about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And she's now the rabbi of a rather large congregation in Riverside. Michelle was a photographer. Remember Donald Trump wrote an autobiography years ago?
Yeah.
She did the cover photo for that book.
Okay. Well, what about your other daughter?
My other daughter is the CEO of a company in Los Angeles which caters to Latino children who are poor. She has 4 schools. She has a health service. She has other services that help them, and she runs the whole thing.
Okay.
So they're all very well employed today.
Now, how long did you stay married to Nicole?
17 years.
17 years. Okay, and then so you
Came out to the West Coast.
You divorced her before you came out?
No, after I came out.
After you came out, okay.
And I married a girl out here,
What was her name?
Marianne.
Marianne.
And she was first in the contact lens business, and then she was in real estate business and made a lot of money in the real estate business.
How long did you stay married to Marianne?
About 3 years.
3 years.
And
Did you get divorced to Marianne also?
Yes,
Okay. Any children?
one boy.
One boy with Marianne. Okay. What's his name?
His name is Brian, and he runs a business in Long Beach which sells Harley-Davidson parts. Harley-Davidson dealers are not permitted to sell either take-off or used parts. So he buys those from them, and he sells them, and does quite well for himself.
All right. So 3 years with Marianne, and then you divorced. And then what happened next?
Well, Michelle got married to a guy by the name of Rob Reiner.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And she has 3 kids, one of whom is a television announcer in Houston.
See, 3 of your grandchildren are also Rob Reiner's kids.
Yes.
Amazing.
And then I married this girl in Lima.
Now, how did you end up in Lima?
I used to travel that area quite frequently, and she was a customer. Her father was the first optician in Peru. He came from Germany in 1931. And she took over his business. She had been Miss Lima when she was 20. And she had a college degree in accounting, in business, and in art. And unfortunately, she died in 1999.
Right. Now, what was her name?
Her name was Rosemary.
Rosemary. She was your 3rd wife.
Yes.
So you married her in what year?
Well, we went together for 20-odd years. We were married for the last 9.
Okay.
She had been married before. She had an autistic son, and she had a husband who wouldn't give her a divorce. So finally, he consented. She got divorced, and we got married.
Now, lastly, as far as career-wise, I left you with Harlequin before. Now, what's your career situation at this point in your life?
At this point in my life, I'm living at the California Veterans Home.
No. I mean, at the point in your life where we're discussing, where you met Marianne and you married her in 1990, and you're in Lima. What were you doing there? Did you have a company in Lima, or?
Well, first of all, up here, I had a company where we redid used optical machinery.
What was the name of that company?
Omni.
Omni. Okay.
And I sold that just before I moved to Lima.
Okay.
And I moved to Lima, and there, with my wife, I set up, she had a couple of optical stores. We expanded to 15 stores.
That was Marianne.
That was Rosemary.
I mean, Rosemary. I'm sorry, Rosemary. Yeah.
And we had 15 stores.
Now, what year did you move to Lima?
In 1968, wait a minute, no, 1994, 1992.
Did you have any children with her, other than her
No.
own children?
No.
Okay.
And then after that, I married a girl called Dina.
Dina?
Yeah, I'm still married to her.
Is she Peruvian?
She's Peruvian. She still lives in Lima. And she has a small problem. She's 40 years younger than I am.
Doesn't sound like a problem to me.
It's a problem. So, yeah, about 2 years ago, my children here decided to bring me back from Peru. So they came down and got me and brought me back. I lived for a year at the at a extended care living home in Riverside, and then I came here about a year and a half ago.
Some questions about when you got out of the service. What was that like? Did you reintegrate into American society rather naturally, or was that pretty abrupt?
I joined the reserve when I came out.
Uh-huh.
And I was in the reserve from 1946 until 1952.
What rank did you attain in reserve?
I was still a first lieutenant.
Okay.
And we went to summer camp one summer up in northern New York State. And when we got there, the officers were told to take a truck over to our quarters. I sat in the cab of the truck and looked at the driver and recognized him. His name was Nelson Rockefeller.
Wow.
So he drove me over to the camp, and that was the last I saw of him.
Did you know him from before?
No, I
okay.
recognized him.
What rank was he at that point?
He was a lieutenant colonel.
All right.
And there we had a bad experience. We built a bridge at night, a floating bridge, 200 feet long. Why 200 feet? I'll never understand. It's the longest bridge I ever built. And it was black at night, absolutely black, no lights permitted. And we dropped a lot of tools and parts overboard. The next morning they came up with a bill of charges for us. They wanted the officers to pay for that.
Out of your own money?
Yeah,
Wow.
we declined.
I would too. I guess what I'm asking is, how did you readjust to civilian life? I mean, how was that?
It was fairly simple because I had the advantage of 1 year at college where I...
One year to go, yeah.
And after that year, it was just normal life again.
Okay. So there wasn't any really readjustment that you had to think about?
No.
Okay. Did you remain in contact with any of the fellow veterans that you served in the European theater with?
For a very brief time, just a matter of months.
You lost contact with them pretty
Yes.
quickly, and you are not in contact with any
No.
of them since then.
Okay. I forgot to ask you, but when you were over there, how did you stay in touch with your family back home? Did you write letters? Or?
Yes, we wrote letters frequently.
Okay. Did you receive mail, I mean, pretty regularly, or was it hard to?
Fairly regularly, yes.
All right. Are you a member of any veterans organizations?
VFW,
VFW, okay. How long have you been a member?
a couple of months.
Okay, that's a new thing then. How did your wartime experience affect your life overall?
It really didn't. I have memories, which I've recounted, but the horrors that I saw at the concentration, we ran across the concentration camp before the end of the war. It had just been found, and there were still inmates walking around. They were just absolutely bones, no flesh on them at all.
What concentration camp was that?
I never found the name of it. It was one in Germany.
But you actually came up upon one.
Came upon one.
How long did you stay there?
Just a few minutes. We were just passing through.
That had to be a horrible experience to see that.
It was a horrible experience.
I imagine.
So other than that, did the wartime experience affect your life long term at all?
I don't think so.
Okay. What life lessons have you learned from the military service, if any?
Well, I think obedience is probably the first one.
What's that?
Obedience,
Obedience. Obeying orders.
obeying orders. And a certain amount of responsibility, which I had and continue to have.
Okay, so obedience to orders, feeling of responsibility. How has your military service impacted your feelings about war and military in general?
Well, I decry war. I think it's a very bad thing to get into. I think that a little bit better political leadership would be a good substitute for war. And I just wonder if we'll ever have it.
Political leadership is good enough so that we don't have to get into war.
That's right.
I see. Okay.
I don't see it happening, but
All right. What message would you like to leave for future generations who will view or hear this video?
I think it's just a question of being adjusted to life, responding to things you should respond to, initiating things you should initiate, and generally being a good citizen.
Okay. Did you feel your military service during World War II helped you to be a better citizen?
I think so, yes.
I would agree. Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed that should be added to this interview?
I don't believe so.
Think we've covered it all?
I think so. Probably too much.
Well, it wasn't too much for me, sir. It's been an honor to interview you.
Thank
And
you.
on behalf of the Conejo Valley chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, on behalf of them, I thank you for your service and your sacrifice during World War II in the U.S. Army.
Thank you.